Thank you, Elizabeth, so much for that introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here this evening and share with all of you my ongoing research. It's a pleasure to be back at the Newport Historical Society. Tonight we're going to investigate, and I'm going to be presenting my argument for Newport being a resort fashion capital, meaning between 1870 and 1920, there were a number of interesting things going on here in Newport that would affect consumer culture and the global fashion industry in the decades to come. So let's take a look. As Elizabeth mentioned, I was here between 2020 and 2021 working with the team here at the Newport Historical Society and collaborating with our friends up the way at the Audrain Automobile Museum to put together this exhibition that explored issues of fashion and modernity. This exhibition showcased the wardrobe of primarily one person, Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alice Vanderbilt of the Breakers. It was an absolute pleasure to work with this collection that is still privately held and cared for by the family. It gave us a particularly unique window into this time period. And I've always been interested in the women of Newport who garnered international celebrity. They were international trendsetters. And I think when we think about the women of the Vanderbilt family, probably Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney loved clothes the most. For sure, for sure. So as much as I'm interested in the women who wore clothes during this time period, I really want to think about the people who made the clothes. So this really wonderful photograph gives us a peek into a couture salon in Paris around 1910. I also really want to think about the unique retail strategies that came to the forefront of the fashion system, particularly here in Newport. Between 1870 and 1920, Newport, Rhode Island experienced a commercial building boom along Bellevue Avenue, where you had these wonderful, beautiful, glittering new storefronts. If we think about the Casino Block, if we think about the Audrain building, it was significant. And then my final ingredient for tonight's talk is, of course, to think about resort lifestyle. What you needed to change in your wardrobe to participate in the resort lifestyle. So we'll be thinking a lot about active sport, playing tennis, and conspicuous leisure, like we see on the screen here. How fantastic. Take us away, right? We all want to be on this boat on a beautiful summer day. So we can sail away, but we have to sail towards Paris. Before we can talk about Newport, let's think about the ultimate fashion capital. I love to sometimes decenter this idea, but it was actually really important what was happening in Paris. And we have landed smack in the middle of the Rue de la Paix, one of Paris's most fashionable streets. And we have arrived at a fantastic time. It's quitting time. So all of the workers are leaving the house of Paquin here, the couture house of Jean Paquin. And just to kind of orientate us a little bit, kind of a definition, a quick overview of what is couture and what is so special about us. Or what is so special about it, rather. We'll jump back in time just a bit to the 18th century, why not? And we'll think about how the wealthy elite acquired their clothing through most of human history. You would arrive at your dressmaker with some fabric in tow, and you would work collaboratively with your dressmaker or tailor to come up with your garments. And this is all going to radically change in the middle part of the 19th century, thanks largely in part to the gentleman that you see depicted on the screen. Charles Frederick Worth was a British textile merchant who emigrated to Paris in 1848, and he landed a great job. He was working at the prestigious Maison Gageline, which was a purveyor of luxury textiles, but he started talking to his higher-ups about, why are we letting people carry fabric away and do goodness knows what with it? Why don't I open a dressmaking studio within our own corporation? I have great ideas about clothes. And that's exactly what he did. And it was successful. However, by 1858 or so, he felt like he'd accomplished all that he could do there, so he went out on his own and established his own maison of couture. And he started to say to people, don't worry about collaborating. Designing is a profession. I have all the great ideas. Trust me, trust me. I'm going to make your clothes for you. And then I'm going to put my name inside them. And that is the beginning of labeling and fashion branding. And the moment was ripe for it. It took off like wildfire. And by the late 19th century, Worth had a lot of competitors. This is a really interesting illustration that ran in the New York Herald Paris edition in April of 1896. And it's actually a bit of a memorial portrait there for Worth. You see that little black ribbon next to him, but his house was well shored up. His sons, Jean-Philippe and Gaston, were at the helm of House of Worth. And we're also going to run into some of these other characters on the screen in tonight's talk. Jacques Doucet at the top center there, and next to him right here, John Redfern. Remember that name. We'll talk about Redfern a little bit later tonight. And in this bottom corner here, closest to me, is the engraved portrait of a gentleman named Isidore René Paquin. And this slightly annoys me, but I've tried for years to get over it, because he was actually the financial backer for the House of Paquin, and it was his genius wife, Jeanne, who was the creative director there. And we can go right to the House of Paquin and take a look inside and see what was going on there in 1905 when we look at this wonderful painting by Henri Gervais. And by this time period, what's happening here, it almost looks like a stop animation picture, right? You can hear these little dogs yapping, the cacophony of noise that is going on in this busy couture salon. And in the center, we have the house model or mannequin. So she's modeling this finished gown for all the ladies here that we see in afternoon dress. They are the shoppers, the customers, the consumers. We also have busy young women, the sales girls or the vendeuses, as they would have been called in French. So this idea is well established now. Let the couturiers, the arbiters of style, the arbiter of fashion, make your clothes for you. So interesting to think about. And the summer exhibition from 2021, we know that Alice Vanderbilt shopped at some of these great Paris houses. This is the room, the Anabaptist meeting house here, and the Gervais painting really served as inspiration for the design team. We wanted people to walk through these doors and feel like you were in a couture salon. Just a couple of other quick photographs that I love so much that are kind of behind the scenes of French dressmaking the early 20th century. By the early 20th century, most of the couture houses had dressmaking and tailoring departments. And that's really about the materials. To work with the beautiful silk, organzas, satins, and taffeta, the stuff of evening gowns, is one skill set. To work with the wool and the linen, the suiting materials, is a different skill set. And women wanted both of those components as part of their wardrobes. A real favorite of mine, the models, or the mannequins as they're called in French. Taking a break here. It's exhausting, modeling beautiful clothes. I'm absolutely sure of it. And then also another favorite from this series are these dresses all boxed up, waiting on the curb here to be picked up by the carriages and delivered to some of Paris's finest and most sophisticated hotels. Gigantic, right? The scale is amazing because these are the types of dresses that are inside there. Some lovely creations by Maison Worth in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. So this business model, this couture system, was incredibly successful. It is like the French continuing to wave the flag. We are the best. We are the most accomplished, most sophisticated designers in the world. Get your inspiration from us. So what did that mean for our dressmakers in New York, in Newport? I think it was a bit burdensome. A little bit soul-crushing, a lot to take. We're trying to get ahead. We're trying to have some of our own ideas and be really creative here. But we also want customers. So when you start looking at late 19th and early 20th century fashion advertising, you're going to see things like this, over and over and over and over and over and over again. Importer, arriving soon, everything from France. France is fabulous. It is the French legend, and we're buying it hook, line, and sinker. So really interesting to think about. And what does this idea of importing French fashion mean? And it could mean a number of different things. What the French haute couture houses wanted it to mean is that you, as a New York dressmaker, were going to come over to Paris periodically, hopefully even biannually, and look at their designs. You were going to select from a small collection of dresses that they had available for licensing. That means come on in, pay us a lot of money, and we'll let you make legal copies of these gowns back in New York for your clients. And it wasn't just boosting up the couture houses, it was fully supporting the French textile industry as well. It was all intertwined. If you want to make a French gown in New York, you're going to need to buy those French fabrics, those French laces, all that French beadwork and embroidery as well. So the French were holding a lot of sway in this time period. And when I start looking at advertisements from fashion magazines, from the Casino Bulletin here in Newport, we see that Newport dressmakers were buying into this as well and advertising this quite heavily. The E.T. Slattery Company was founded in Boston by Ellen Slattery, and it was a hugely successful business, big business on Tremont Street in Boston, and she branch expanded her Boston business here to Newport and also to Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And that was really smart. And a lot of regional branch expansion was really happening in these resort cities, and I think it was really innovative, and American dressmakers really bolstered up their own businesses in this way. And I was really excited last month to go to Teresa Stokes' wonderful talk that she gave at Marble House. And she introduced me to Mary Dickinson, who is in the top center here. And she's an African-American dressmaker that had a very successful business here in Newport. And Teresa explained to those of us who were at the lecture that Mary Dickinson's business was one that allowed her a certain amount of economic agency, and she paid it forward. She supported her community. She helped African Americans living in the rural South come up here to Newport and its booming resort economy, and they were able to well establish themselves here. And a lot of the Irish American dressmakers that I have been researching applied a similar principle. Get yourself established and expand your business. Go into business with a friend, a cousin, a sister. And Newport was a great place to do that. The resort economy gave people a lot of opportunity. I was really thrilled to see this in Mary's advertisements as well. She knew what was going on in Paris. And I was also really interested to see that she was advertising fitting as a specialty. You know, that signals to me that she was a great dressmaker and she was hiring great dressmakers. The thing about dressmaking is it's more than seamstress work. You have to understand how to do this, that. You understand fabric. You understand about cutting on grain, intentionally cross grain, or on the bias. So you really needed to know what you were doing in the Gilded Age to make beautiful clothes. So I was thrilled to meet Mary Dickerson because she was the neighbor up there on Bellevue Avenue of the Irish-American dressmaker I've been researching, a woman named Catherine Donovan. And the New York dressmakers were following suit with the French. Okay, you're going to put your name in clothes, we'll put our name in clothes too. So the eponymous label becomes a really important part of the fashion system, and of course still is today. Why do we have Michael Kors and Calvin Klein? All of these things very interrelated, right? So I first came across Catherine Donovan's name when I was researching the wedding dress of Consuelo Vanderbilt. Unfortunately, it's not extant. And like everything, there's all sorts of contradictory reports in the press about who made this dress. Some attribute it to Charles Frederick Worth. Some attribute it to Jacques Doucet. And some people say that it was made by Catherine Donovan. I support that theory. I like it. Much of what we know about Catherine Donovan comes from her New York Times obituary. This is just a little clipping of it, and it was pretty newsy, several paragraphs long. So I think Catherine Donovan was incredibly well known in her day, and her name has been somewhat lost to history. So I'm trying to reveal her legacy. But it announces that the 400 dressmaker is dead, you know, these really dramatic obituaries of the period. But she had a more than 50-year design career, so she dressed more than 3 generations of the Astors, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, etc. And also this fun little tidbit that her customers actually referred to her as Madame Donovan, because that idea of all things being French and fabulous, that's kind of tucked into the biographies of a lot of New York dressmakers. So I find that pretty fascinating. And I was always suspicious about Catherine Donovan, wondering if she expanded her business to Newport. Did she follow her clients on summer vacation? And thankfully, I found this ad from the Newport Daily News, the summer of 1885, and she did. You know, she's showing her address at 5th Avenue in New York and 7 Casino Block. And I think that this is really fascinating. We know she's importing things, and I love this. She's going to stay 2 weeks longer here in Newport to receive clients and complete orders. Fantastic. I can order a couple of things before the summer officially flits away. So I love that New York dressmakers were doing this. As much as I know about Catherine Donovan, some things are still a little bit shadowy. I don't have a photograph of her. We don't know what the inside of her couture salon looked like. So I grabbed this television still from the HBO Gilded Age series, which I think many of us are probably watching carefully and thinking about. But this gives you a good sense of what one of these bustling New York brownstones, using that parlor floor as your dressmaking salon, and what that experience might have been like. And from the pieces of Catherine Donovan that are known in collections and that I've had an opportunity to look at, they are beautifully made clothes, right on par with the quality of things that were coming from Paris. So all that being said about Catherine Donovan, and as I mentioned, she passed away or died in 1906, and there was a young Irish-American dressmaker waiting in the wings. And I think that she probably modeled her career after Catherine's and was ready to take the reins. And that was a young woman named Molly O'Hara. So we know a lot about Molly Through a series of somewhat unfortunate experiences for Molly, she was sued 4 times. So these court records are fully online and digitized now, so I have learned a lot about the operation of Molly's business. But I first met Molly in 2006 when I was doing some research at the Redwood Library and just flipping through magazines, which I always advise my graduate students to do, because although many things have been digitized now, I found Catherine Donovan's ad by accident. I've put her in every Newport newspaper database that I possibly can, and her ads don't come up. But I found it, needle in a haystack, the old-fashioned way, flipping through newspapers that are falling apart. So anyway, that's how I discovered Molly as well, looking at magazines, and I just started a folder, a file, anytime I saw that these dressmakers had Newport branches of their business. So that was 2006, and I didn't hear a peep from her for more than 10 years. And that's when I started working with some of the dresses in the Breakers Archive collection, and I finally found a garment that had a Molly O'Hara label in it. So I was really excited to think about all of these ideas. And the label that you saw on the screen is in this lovely black suit that was part of the summer exhibition here at the Newport Historical Society. So we see it on the platform there. It dates to about 1913, and we very much think it was worn by Alice Vanderbilt. So a couple of more details of it here. So beautifully made. So now I had an advertisement, I had the material culture, all the things I love, and I went back to the fashion magazines to see what else I could learn about Molly. And stuff started coming up pretty quickly. The first mention of Molly was actually in 1897, and she won a New York design competition sponsored by Vogue magazine. And the thing I love about this competition is that the designers were invited to make quarter-scale models. So I think it allowed young people or up-and-coming designers to participate in the competition, and then they arranged all of these designs on tables festooned with the garlands, you know, as we see here, looking really fantastic, and people could come check out the designs. And the great thing about Molly winning this competition for her dinner dress that she submitted is then her photograph ended up being in Vogue magazine. So we quite literally get to meet Molly O'Hara. We've talked a lot about this photo. She doesn't look super excited here. But by 1907, she appears in an illustration in the New York Tribune, and she looks like a really well-established, confident dressmaker here. I think she's well self-styled in this really beautiful suit. So by this time period in 1907, Molly was really at the height of her career. And again, when we know the woman's name that is associated with an eponymous label, that's great. But I also think about the hundreds of other people that were working behind the scenes in these businesses. And Molly O'Hara, from the court records, I know had a business partner named Sarah Thompson. And unfortunately, Sarah and Mary have a big dispute in the 1920s. And one of Sarah's complaints about being in business with Molly, whose real name was Mary, by the way, Mary Charlotte, so Molly was her nickname, she complains that, you know, Molly was always off buying things. She was always in Paris having a grand old time, and I was kind of managing the business back in New York and Newport. But that legitimizes, we know that Molly was traveling to France, and Vogue magazine often starts documenting in the 19-teens the particular couture style of gowns that she was importing for her customers. So we have on the far side there a gown by Calosser, in the center a gown by Jean Paquin, and here a gown by Primet, another really prestigious couturier of this time period. So the thing about Molly, though, is fashion starts changing pretty radically during the time span of her career. And her business was in play. She was sort of at the helm of her business into the middle part of the 1930s. And I think she was able to have that success because she kept up with the times. And around 1920, after her and Sarah Thompson have this amazing kind of dispute over the business, Molly goes ahead and starts partnering with a woman named Mrs. Ralston. And Mrs. Ralston's studios, she was very New York focused. She was very interested in making simple sportswear. And I think Molly saw this on the horizon, and she knew her network was very Paris focused. So the idea about partnering with Mrs. Ralston is like, I've got to get some friends in New York. I think the fashion system is about to change. And it was very successful for them. And they expanded the business beyond just New York and Newport. They set up a shop in Palm Beach, Florida. And all of this, I think, is really interesting to consider. You know, this idea of branch expansion was done so fantastically by these American dressmakers regionally. And you know, why do we have gaps in every city around the world? It influenced the global fashion system. And again, you know, thinking who else was working at the Molly O'Hara studio, found this little news report from Women's Wear Daily that, you know, she was employing buyers. You know, this young woman, Anna Montag, was dispatched to Paris as a buyer. I've read little memoirs and anecdotes of women who embroidered for Molly O'Hara. A wonderful young woman named Agnes Sullivan wrote about working at the Molly O'Hara shop in the Audrain building here in Newport, and she was super excited because at the end of the season she was going to get to go to New York. So I love to think about all of the hidden stories behind these labels. And another fantastic one of Molly's ads, just orientating us back to the Audrain block and thinking and reflecting a bit on our exhibition from 2 summers ago. We approached the Audrain Automobile Museum saying, hey, we know this dressmaker had a shop in your building. I know you really like to show cars here, but can I show clothes here? And they said, okay. So we've been hunting around on both sides and, you know, thinking about what Molly's shop might have looked like. We don't have any pictures, but, you know, looking at comparison photographs, I found this really wonderful photograph of the Bon Ton Millinery shop here in Newport, Rhode Island. It was located at 223 Thames Street. I have seen lots of images in Vogue magazine of the shops along Fifth Avenue, Molly's neighbors in New York City. And she's written about in this article, but her store is not one of the ones that was photographed. So we were sort of working with the exhibition design team, putting our heads together, you know, what is this shop going to look like? And I started looking more widely back at some of the other advertisements that I had gathered, the types of things I was seeing in the casino bulletin. And I love this from the L.P. Hollander Company. They tell us a lot about their business. They have branches in Boston, New York, and Paris, which I really wonder if they do. I hope they do. I'm digging. I'm trying to find out. And they also branch expanded to the resorts of not only Newport, Rhode Island, but Watch Hill, Rhode Island, Palm Beach, Florida, and Santa Barbara, California. So they're really going for it, becoming bi-coastal. And I also love they tell us all the things that they have. Ladies' gowns, which would have still needed to be custom fit, but they also have lots of accessories and things that don't need a particular fit, you know, such as coats. And this type of off-the-rack, kind of ready-to-wear things, I think, was really important in resort cities. Shopping is a leisure pursuit, and you want that instant gratification of being able to go in and buy something ready to wear. But you don't want to ostracize anybody who wants that custom fit, so they let you know that there's a fitter always on site and in attendance. And I have wondered about that a lot with Molly. I think that she was surfing this line as well. You wanted to have the ready-to-wear clothes, but you also wanted to have a fitter in as well. And again, you know, all these advertisements talk a lot about the foreign buyer just returning from Paris. Come on and see us. We have all the fantastic new great things in the salon. So this is what we ended up coming up with, the Molly Boutique recreated, reimagined at the Audrain Museum. Again, I wanted to really incorporate this idea that I think there was still some custom dressmaking, some seamstresses, some people sewing, perhaps upstairs at the Audrain building. So that was really just tremendous to kind of bring all of these clothing back to the space where they were potentially sold. Molly loved Newport. She invested in a lot of real estate here. She died in Newport in 1941 at her house on Old Beach Road. And Molly brought the attention of the international fashion press to Newport. Molly was an early proponent and supporter of the Fashion Fête in New York, and this was held in 1914, and it's a really important moment for fashion historians. We think of it as an early example of kind of a runway-style fashion show. This particular Fashion Fête was promoting American fashion. And it caused a problem with the French. They were quite upset about it. And the following year, Vogue magazine was like, okay, yeah, no, sorry. And they actually had this big French couture show. So it's really interesting to think about. So the initial fête was in New York City. But all the designers got together, the society women who supported it got together and said, you know, where could we stage this in the summer? And it came to Newport in July of 1914. And this is a lovely day dress. This is what Molly submitted to the fashion show, and she named it Casino because she loves the Newport Casino. And we just really had a great time working on the exhibition and like thinking about some of these great sportswear looks. You know, costumes for polo, why not? You know, this great blanket coat, these fantastic bathing suits. And the show just garnered so much attention here in Newport. People really enjoyed it. The day started off with young women going around Newport and selling tricolor boutonnieres to people as their tickets. So if you showed up with this red, white, and blue corsage on, they're like, come on in, you can check out the fashion show. There was a charitable element to it as well. It was to support the war relief effort, to support women and children who had been displaced from the First World War. A whole slew of contemporary modern ballerinas came. They were dancing in the fountain at Rosecliff, which was the fantastic setting for this fashion show. And the very well-known ballerina Lydia Lopakova was here. This is a great photograph of her, I think rather posed, because apparently she did a special encore performance for VIP ticket holders later in the evening. It was a full moon, and she hid in one of the urns until the moon rise and then popped out and did a moonlit ballet for everyone. So fantastic, right? And all of these photographs were taken by an incredible photographer named Ira Hill, who was very much the Bill Cunningham of his day. So it was a big deal that he had came to Newport and photographed this. These are all the wonderful society women who supported the event, our arbiters of fashion. We see in the center there Mrs. Craig Biddle, and then that is Mrs. Howard Cushing dressed as Joan of Arc. And that's sort of acknowledging this great Franco-American alliance in all things. But in many ways, it was sort of the rumblings of the end of this old system in my mind. Because what is coming is that American sportswear is going to be all the rage. And clothing starts changing pretty radically and pretty quickly after the First World War. There was a tremendous amount of disruption to travel. Buyers couldn't get to Paris. Dyes and textile supplies that were needed here in New York couldn't make it because of the naval blockades. So it really forced the American clothing and garment industry to figure out how to get up and stand on your own 2 feet. And a designer who I've been really interested in learning more about, and I've just been doing some very beginning research into the life and career of a woman named Alice Maynard. Her advertisements appear often in the Casino Bulletin, but I haven't been able to prove that she had a shop here in Newport, but I'm suspicious that maybe she did, or that she was importing and distributing ready-made accessories such as the motoring scarves that we see here, beautiful sweaters. She was very much adopting a business model that put ready-to-wear clothing at its center. So she was kind of even that leap and bound ahead of Molly. She saw the future. Because people are going to start wanting to set aside all of these more old-fashioned contraptions, the corsets and the hoop skirts that didn't really allow you to participate in an active resort lifestyle. And again, another part of tonight's talk is to really think about Newport as a resort fashion capital. And when reading all the fashion magazines between 1870 and 1920, and I've been at it for years, I think I maybe have read all of them at this point, I see Newport mentioned time and time again with some of the most wonderful quotes. So I'm just going to grab a few. I pulled a few out and have them on some note cards down here, because this is one of my favorites. And this comes from an 1886 edition of Harper's Bazaar. And you know, people just like today look to fashion magazines for advice, you know, like, oh goody, I'm going on vacation, but what do I bring? What do I wear? Oh my goodness. So Harper's Bazaar explains that formerly, when a party of young ladies might be setting off for a summer resort, it was considered a sufficient equipment for the season's amusement if you went armed with a novel. Now, each has a novel, but is also equipped with a tennis racket. Right? So here we see. And I'm really not sure how she's playing tennis in this bustle gown. It looks downright dangerous. I actually prefer the novel, even today, with all of the leaps and bounds that we have made in American sportswear. But over and over again, you start to see these costumes for people to participate in sport. So the 1860s and 70s and 80s were really demarked by tennis. And the next sport to really come to the forefront of people's attention was bicycling. And here are some Newporters with their bicycles. This photograph was taken in Paris, but I like to imagine they brought their bikes to Newport as well. And Vogue magazine gives a lot of advice about how to dress for bicycling. And I love this Vogue cover from 1895. How fantastic does she look? She is completely free. She is on this bicycle, coasting down the hill, leaving that guy in the dust behind her, right? Unwanted suitor. What is happening here? Love it. Now, Vogue goes on to talk quite specifically, and Harper's Bazaar does as well, about bicycling in Newport. And they tell you, when you're on Bellevue Avenue at Newport, the smartest women are to be seen on wheels every day. Vogue tells you at Newport, the bicycle interest spreads daily, and there are few society women or men who are not either riding or learning to ride. But as a rule, as might be expected, beginners do not practice on Bellevue Avenue. They may be seen guiding their wheels in the early morning or late afternoon on sequestered side streets. Great advice. You don't want to fall off your bike on Bellevue Avenue. You might become an international news sensation. And here's a really fantastic example of an extant cycling costume from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. And I love it. It's showing you this kind of very demure skirt in the front, but this bifurcated skirt in the back that's starting to look like little culottes. So it makes it a little bit safer for you to ride a bike. And we see that going on here. So perhaps your clothes are safe now, but you need to watch out for that carriage coming right at you. Busy, busy two-way traffic on Bellevue Avenue, and I've talked a lot with the Audrain guys about now how cars get added to the mix as we move in to the early 20th century. But luckily, the illustrators for Harper Bazaar let us know that everybody does arrive safe at the casino. We recognize those lighting fixtures, right? So all's well that ends well in Newport on a beautiful summer day. So speaking of wheels, we will just talk about cars for a minute. I think that women's desire to drive cars, bicycling is one amount of freedom, but to hop behind the wheel of an automobile was really a whole new adventure. So women needed clothes to participate in this new conspicuous leisure pursuit. And some of the images really start to look like something out of Jules Verne, right? These are some of the fantastic steampunky images that we showcased as part of the 2021 exhibition at Audrain. These folks are kitting up for a Christmas Day ride, hence all the furs and the full coverage face masks. The team here at NHS has pulled a wonderful set of driving goggles out of the collection that are in the display case. If you didn't have a chance to take a peek on the way in, I highly recommend checking them out. They are so cool. And you would definitely, need this type of gear riding in this type of open-top car. So I wanted to circle back to something that I mentioned many, many minutes ago now. I told everyone to remember John Redfern, right? So another supporting fact for our argument of Newport, Rhode Island being a resort fashion capital is that not only were New York designers or Boston designers regionally expanding here, international designers were finding their way to Newport. John Redfern's company actually began on the Isle of Wight, the city of cows, in the UK, and then he expanded to Paris, and then he comes to New York. He comes to Newport. So first, initially, they rented the parlor floor of Berkeley Cottage. Then they get an address on Bellevue Avenue. And the Redfern Company branch expanded to cities around the globe. They were probably the biggest branch expanded of all of the couture houses. And it eventually became a little bit unwieldy for them. They were in Edinburgh, they were in Cannes, they were, everywhere. So it's just interesting to think about. But the University of Rhode Island's collection has this incredibly lovely tailored coat from about 1895, and I love the label. Thinking about Newport in context. Here we see Newport and all of these royal warrants surrounded. So again, just really kind of thinking about Newport, Rhode Island's place in the history of fashion. I really do think that the desire for clothes to participate in sport and the really creative, nimble, inventive business models of the women who were working here made it a resort fashion capital. You wanted to do things. You wanted to hop on trolleys and go places. And you needed clothes that made it safe to do that. That's what the John Redfern Company was finally providing women with. You wanted to hop on this trolley and you wanted to go down what we now know as Memorial Boulevard to this beautiful beach and ride this roller coaster, right? So just kind of thinking about Newport, as a place where people were starting to push the envelope and think about clothing and the presentation of themselves, the way clothing was retailed as being new and inventive. It's not quite summer yet, but I wanted to end tonight's talk by taking us to the beach and just sharing with you another fantastic quote from one of our fashion magazine's correspondents. So this writer says, "On the succeeding Saturday, I took advantage of an invitation to the Queen of Watering Places and betook myself to Newport with the rest. And the fair city by the sea, I do not mind saying, took my heart by storm, and I no longer wondered that rich men spent their millions there. I have seen almost every watering place of Europe, from the Isle of Wight to Biarritz, and I have no hesitation in saying that not one of them compares to Newport." That was a lot of information, a lot of people, right? Questions? Anybody? Do we have time for questions? Lizzie.
The labels, like when did labels start appearing in clothes? Is that the first?
I think people were playing around with this idea, and in the fashion history world, we sort of fight about royal warrants and, some of these types of things. But, Charles Frederick Worth is really credited in that moment in fashion history with being, when it really cemented itself. Absolutely. So 1850s is kind of the birth of that idea. But everybody started doing it really quickly. And, they really started changing the labels pretty often. There was this whole business about illegal copying, which I'm super interested in, and design piracy during this time period. So the designers were kind of constantly changing up their label to avoid fakes, and all of it is really kind of fascinating. You can get lost researching it all. Ideas?
You said that Molly was involved in several lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on any of those?
Right. I certainly don't want to give away all Molly's secrets, but I will. So her and her business partner sued and countersued. When Molly partnered with Mrs. Ralston, Sarah Thompson was like, wait, what? We are our partners, and Molly claimed that Sarah was just an employee, but it seems like she really had money invested in the business, and that was the one lawsuit. She had 2 disastrous marriages, poor Molly, and the second really big lawsuit involves her separation from her second husband, John Morrison, who was a dry good merchant. And, Molly emigrated. She came from Ireland when she was a young woman with her mother and her sister. They're all mentioned as being seamstress dressmakers in census records, and they landed in New York. I think they knew where they were going. They were very much part of this Irish-American network of people involved in the clothing trade.
Did she have children?
She had 2 daughters with her first husband, David Seaton. And her first business was very conjoined with him. And they first came to Newport in 1900, and they were in the dressmaking trade under the David Seaton name, and they were renting space on Perry Street. And after her divorce from David Seaton, she immediately went to the newly finished Audrain building, and I think she must have had a blockbuster opening, reestablishing herself under her own label.
Was she the one you said lived on Old Beach Road?
Yep, she lived on Old Beach Road. Oof, I do have the number of her house somewhere in my notes, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Was she renting it, or did she buy a house?
She bought it. She had property on Rhode Island Avenue. Molly's business was very successful. That's another thing that I also learned from the lawsuits. So at the time of her death, her estate was valued at what would be the equivalent of about $4 million today. So well done, Molly. She took care of her mother and she took care of her daughters, and she really took care of her family. I think, you know, the great thing about some of these branch expansions that they were ways to support various members of your family. Your sister, your daughter, your aunt goes off to open the second branch, but you know the ropes, you know, you have this kind of solid footing. And here in Newport, I think the short season gave people some, you know, courage to experiment, like let's go and try it. And a lot of these boutiques were pop-ups. They just completely disappeared in the winter. So, you know, you could come.
I'm impressed with these women being entrepreneurs back in those days. And it just brings to mind a little bit of course, in France where you have Coco. And who's the other woman that did sort of things?
Schiaparelli.
Yeah, it's just incredible when you think about the times and how they didn't even have the right to vote until 1920. That's right.
It's so true. It's
Up until 19, I don't know, whatever it was, they couldn't own property in their own name. I just, wow.
It's fascinating. I know. Go, Molly.
So one of the things Teresa didn't talk about either, that was a great lecture also.
Right.
Being a seamstress and somebody that actually does couture sewing, who were all these women that helped them? Because I know what it takes to make one of those dresses, and you don't do it by yourself. So you talked a little bit about bringing other women in. Do you know anything about the petite main in America and who they were and
I am
how they
digging, and yes, and one woman named Mary Claruso, she talked about emigrating from Italy, and she landed in Molly O'Hara's atelier in New York, and she was an embroiderer. So, you know, I'm thinking that Molly must have had hundreds of people working for her. And again, you know, just using some of the numbers, I know, like at the height of Jean Paquin's, you know, success, over 2,000 people were working for her, you know, and I have to think that's a lot, but, you know, I'm thinking Molly must have had maybe 400 people at least working for her, you know, and then.
Wasn't there a big, you know, seamstress strike or a big fire where all the women.
well, the shirtwaists.
Right.
Shirtwaists. That was in
I think 1911,
16, something like that.
yeah.
Well, Molly was, you know, leaving the state of 4 million. I think some of her helpers were maybe.
Well, the couture industry is so interesting even today, but especially back then. You know, the ornamentation on these dresses is amazing. So the amount, the sheer numbers and the breadth of what these craftsmen did were incredible. You know, the flowers, the embroidery, you know, you name it. It's the beadwork. I mean, it's really
The
incredible.
threading, the threads, the thread.
Yeah, just embroidery alone, exactly. And the textile, like you were saying, the textiles are so interesting. And you know, it's hard enough to make a couture dress today. To make it in those days, it was really hard. You know,
Exactly.
To make a corset like that, it takes a lot. So
Right.
just the corset, that's just underneath. Never mind, right? Exactly.
Yeah, and the inside of the dresses are, you know, just so beautiful. And Katie Williams O'Donnell, who helped me dress the show, is back there. So we were working, you know, up close and personal with Molly's clothes. And oh my gosh, right, Katie? Yeah, all the layers and just, oh, so much, for sure. Anything else? Well, thank you. Oh, no, go.
If you weren't buying couture, where were you getting your clothes?
Right.
Making it at home?
Right, and that's where I'm really trying to drive this research as well. And I think, you know, how did I edit tonight's talk? And, you know, I sort of look back at what I put together, and I'm like, oh, I didn't really talk about the shops on Thames Street. So, like, you know, I'm really trying to expand it out and kind of myth bust. You know, we know so much of what we think about Gilded Age fashion, you know, comes from what we read in Edith Wharton's writing. And, you know, just what I'm finding, you know, in the collections and in the diaries, like even women who were very wealthy, they wore their dresses more than once. They reworked them. There was a whole secondary market for these dresses. Things got passed down to shop girls and ladies' maids and went on and had second lives. I'm hugely fascinated by the secondhand clothing trade and what that might have been like, and what aspirational working girls like myself would have bought in the Gilded Age is something that I'm definitely investigating, and I want to be a bigger part of this project for sure. So thanks for the question. Yeah, well, thanks so much, everyone.